Corbett with Contemporary Bluegrass Banjo. Today, I'm so excited to review a brand new banjo. This is actually prototype number 2 of the Béla Fleck signature model from Gold Tone, the My Bluegrass Heart banjo. So, a little bit of story time here. Béla is actually the very first banjo player that I ever heard that I guess paid attention to. I had heard Earl play on the Car Talk theme on NPR kind of throughout my childhood with my dad. But my brother and I stumbled upon the David Grisman Quintet, the very first record of that in my parents' record collection. And then my brother told one of his friends' dads that we really liked that record, and so he lent him a bunch of CDs, and one of them was Béla Fleck's Double Time record, which is a bunch of duets. And when I heard that record and I heard that sound, I just had to find a banjo. I had to play banjo. I was 14 when that happened, so maybe a month or two later I had my first lesson with Dave Keenan in Seattle, and it was off to the races after that. So Béla's really my first and kind of still most influential reference for the banjo. So it's so cool for me to have one of these banjos before they're even really available to the public. There were 3 prototypes made. Béla has number 1 and this is number 2. So let's get into some details of what makes this banjo so special. So Béla's setup is a really, really specific thing. His banjo is a TB-75, a pre-war Gibson. These are sort of the like Stradivarius of bluegrass banjos, right? These are the things that people pay a lot of money for. But the neck was made custom for the instrument. He's not using the original neck. And the neck on his banjo is really specific. It's huge. It's really, really wide, but actually not necessarily that deep, right? So it's wide this way and quite radiused, but not super deep here. It's actually pretty thin. And it's made of mahogany. The way that the heel is fitted, so the heel is where the neck meets the pot assembly. It's fitted up towards the strings a little bit, just a little bit. And then it has a 7/8 tall bridge. That's very, very tall, right? Standard like Gibson setup is a 5/8 bridge. So there we go. Very, very tall bridge. So what we end up with, especially with a lower head tension around like F sharp, maybe getting close to a G, is where I have this right now, and that's kind of Béla's setup zone. What we end up with is this instrument that's really, really alive, but kind of has a super, super full mid-range and bass, in addition to having a nice like kind of pop in the top end. And this instrument's really achieving that incredibly well. So the pot assembly is Gold Tone's OB3, which I'm just kind of really pleasantly surprised by how alive this instrument is. And I've actually played a couple of OB3s with more kind of standard setup and neck, and been really surprised by how alive those instruments are too. So it makes a lot of sense taking this pot assembly that just rings so well, like every fret, it's all really even. Maybe the tone isn't quite as nuanced as my old Gibson is, but it's still pretty amazing. Maybe it's like 5% that's missing, right? So we have pretty big frets on this, quite a bit of radius. There's a couple of other details that Béla has taken into account here. We have brass tuning pegs on the tuners. He said really specifically that he's used Keith tuners, like 4 Keith tuners on his banjo for years because he really likes the tone. So these brass tuning buttons add more mass to the headstock, and it really does seem to make a difference in terms of kind of the sustain and the presence. I think coupled with a mahogany neck, which is like not quite as dense as maple, which is what I would normally play with. I actually tried these tuners on my other banjo, and they really didn't, on my maple neck banjo, and they really didn't do what they're doing to this banjo. It's an interesting thing. So I think coupling these brass tuner buttons with the mahogany neck is a really special thing. So it's a no-hole tone ring that's made, you know, by Gold Tone. It's a one-piece flange, a Pruka tailpiece, a little mountain style armrest is what's going to come standard on these. I don't think it's going to look exactly like this one, but it's going to be this style, which means that it clamps to the hooks and doesn't actually touch the banjo at all, other than clamping to those hooks, which means that it just lets the pot assembly ring even more. Everything about Béla's setup is about just getting this huge kind of open sound out of the banjo. It comes standard with a satin finish. You can see that we've got some, you know, nice detailing here. It's basically the flying eagle inlay pattern with a couple of hearts kind of snuck in there. So there's a red one here at 12, and on 3 you kind of displace some of the standard flying eagle for another heart in relief, and then there's a big heart on the headstock, right? So it's all themed with Béla's new record, which if you have not heard my Bluegrass Heart, you definitely need to hear it. It's a pretty game-changing record for bluegrass banjo. One last little setup thing about this: it also comes standard with a 0 fret. What that means is that this is the nut right here, right? Typically on a banjo, the strings would just go straight from the nut out over the fingerboard. This has a fret, actually, that the strings sit on top of. And what this does is it essentially keeps the math, the geometry, really equal, right? So that it feels the same down here, how hard it is to push down the strings, and how well everything intonates. It feels the same here as it does all the way up the neck. And it's something that Béla has been using for the last while. It makes a lot of sense. I tend to use just a typical nut, but when I ask luthiers for setup, I have them bring the nut slots down to like just the tiniest bit above 0 fret. But having played on this banjo quite a bit in the last week or two, I'm beginning to maybe wonder if I should put a 0 fret on my instrument too, because it just feels so good. Yeah, well, there we go. There is the Béla Fleck Gold Tone signature model. I'm really excited to have this in my hands. I'm actually thinking about transitioning this to being my main touring banjo with the Sam Bush Band. It just feels really good, and it's a new instrument. There's so much about it that I really like, and having played banjos, having played Béla's banjo a number of times, his main banjo called Number 1, this does an incredible job of replicating that. And this is a setup that you really can't buy standard from anyone else. So if you're interested in Béla's sound and Béla's setup, look no further than this banjo. Thanks so much.